The wind was restless that evening, rolling down from the high country in long, sighing breaths, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and dust, and the kind of quiet that feels older than the hills themselves up on the ridge. A lone cabin hunched against the weather, its roof sagging in the middle, its boards grayed by decades of sun and snow. It looked like it might fold in on itself at any moment, like an old man bowing under the weight of years alive. Mercer rode up the main street of Dry Creek with a key in his pocket and a dozen eyes watching him from porches, doorways, and the swinging doors of the saloon. Men leaned on hitching rails, spitting tobacco into the dust, and women paused in their sweeping, murmuring to one another as he passed. They knew where he was going, and they knew what he'd been. Left shame, after all these years, to come back for that? A man near the livery muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. Another chuckled, it's fit for raccoons. Not men. The laughter was low but sharp, the kind that isn't meant to invite you in, only to remind you you're outside. Eli didn't look at them. His gaze stayed fixed on the far rise where the cabin waited. He'd learned long ago that words spoken from pride are best answered with silence. He hadn't seen the place in nearly 15 years, not since he was a boy, riding up there with his mother to take his grandfather bread and coffee beans. His father had called the old man stubborn, said he was half mad for living alone, carving wood in the dark, speaking to no one for weeks on end. When his father left town, chasing work, chasing luck, chasing something, Eli stayed with his mother until she passed, and then he drifted like so much tumbleweed. Odd jobs, long roads, nothing that lasted longer than a season. The letter came in late autumn, thick, folded paper with his name written in a hand. He didn't recognize it, said his grandfather had died the month before, and that Eli was the only heir. The will was simple. The cabin is yours. Take it or leave it. Most folks in Dry Creek would have left it, but Eli came back. The path to the ridge was narrower than he remembered, willows grown thick along the creek, stones half buried in the trail. His boots stirred dust into the air as he walked the last stretch on foot, leading his horse by the reins. The cabin stood just as the townsfolk had described, weathered, leaning, patched with mismatched boards, but in the sinking gold of the evening sun, it didn't look pitiful. To Eli it looked steadfast, like it had been waiting for him, holding on through the years. The key fit the lock with a stubborn twist, and the door groaned open on hinges that had forgotten their work. Inside was the smell of cedar and dust, and something else, faint, like the echo of pipe smoke in winter stew. The air was cool and still, holding its breath. After so many seasons without company, he set his saddlebag on the rough plank floor and took in the single room, a cold hearth in the corner, with a blackened iron pot still hanging on its hook, a rocking chair beside it, the seat worn smooth by years of use. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars of nails, a lantern without oil, and a row of books thick with dust. In the highest shelf sat a wooden box, small, square, carved with swirling lines that had darkened with age. Eli lifted it down, felt its surprising weight. The lid didn't budge, locked tight. There was no key in sight. Beside the box was a single photograph in a frame, chipped at the edges. A woman, maybe in her 30s, hair pinned back, eyes steady on the camera. He didn't know her face, and no name was written on the back. He set both back where he'd found them and moved to the window. From there he could see the town below, small, scattered, faint under the long evening shadows. The sound of laughter carried up faintly, though he couldn't hear the words anymore that night. He lit the old lantern with a stub of candle. The flame shivered and threw light on the log walls, on the knots and grain that time had silvered to gray outside. Coyotes called to each other over the ridge, their voices threading through the wind like something ancient. And unbroken Lie sat in the rocking chair, boots off, feet stretched toward the cold hearth. He thought about his grandfather, a man he barely knew, a man the town had called crazy, but who had somehow managed to hold this place against time and weather. Let them laugh, he thought. Let them think it's nothing but rotting boards and a leaking roof. This place is mine now, and I'll see what it has to say before I'm through by morning. The frost on the grass glistened like glass under the sun. Eli stepped outside, feeling the boards of the porch flex under his weight. A hawk drifted slow circles overhead. The air was sharp and clean, different from the dust of the towns he'd wandered through before he walked the small patch of ground behind the cabin. Found the remnants of an old garden, just dry stalks now. But the soil was dark. The creek wasn't far. He could hear its chatter over stones somewhere in his chest. Something settled. It wasn't peace exactly. It was the quiet you get when you've been moving too long and finally stopped that evening. As he returned from hauling water, he saw a fresh mark on the cabin door. Letters scrawled in chalk. Fool's anesthesia. Handwriting was messy, but the message clear enough. Eli brushed the chalk away with his palm. No sense in keeping other folks' opinions hanging where you live inside. He poured water into the kettle and set it by the fire. The boards creaked softly as he moved, the cabin answering him in its own language like it was glad for company again, and, though he couldn't have said why, Eli found himself speaking into the dim room, as if the old man might still be there to hear. "I'll take care of it," he said quietly. "I'll take care of it. And we'll see what comes of that." The ridge fell into darkness by the time the kettle whistled, and in the glow of the small lamp, the cabin didn't look so worn out anymore. It looked like it was listening. Eli leaned back in the rocker, cup, warming his hands, listening to the soft knock of wind against the walls. The laughter from town was far away now, and the only sound close enough to touch was the steady breathing of a place that might just turn out to be worth more than anyone knew. The winter had broken its back, and spring was moving like a slow tide through the valley. It began with the creek, first a trickle under the ice, then a clear ribbon racing over stones, carrying the smell of wet earth and new grass up toward the rig. Eli was down there that morning with his axe and saw, cutting a pile of winter-fallen limbs to stack for drying. The sun was still low, casting the water in silver and the banks in gold dats, when he saw Hershey was kneeling at the water's edge, her skirt hitched above her knees to keep it from the wet. Hands sunk into the creek as she scrubbed a shirt against a rock. Her hair was dark and tied back, but wisps had escaped, catching the light like threads of copper. Her sleeves were rolled, and the cold water had turned her skin pink. The way she worked was quiet and sure, the kind of quiet that comes from being used to your own company. She looked up only once when Eli stepped into view. Her eyes were quick, steady, then gone again, returning to her washing, as if he were no more than a shadow passing over the grass. Eli watched a moment longer than he meant to, then cleared his throat and called across the water, "Need a hand with that?" Her voice came back even and flat. "No, thank you." But when she hauled the bucket up onto the bank, he saw the weight of it tug at her shoulders, and without asking again he crossed to her side. She didn't fight him, she just let go of the handle, and stood back watching him carry the bucket up the small hill toward the road. The walk was a quiet one. Their boots pressed soft shapes into the damp earth, and the only sound was the creek behind them and the call of a meadowlark somewhere in the brush. At the edge of town they came to a weathered house with a sagging porch. An older woman stood in the doorway, hands on hips. Her face was sharp, and her eyes went straight to Eli like a hawk measuring the distance to a mouse. "You can set that there," she said, pointing to the boards beside her. Eli did as told, stepping back after the older woman looked him over, then looked past him toward the ridge. "That's Mercer's boy, isn't it? The one with the shack." Eli gave a slow nod. "Cabin," he said simply. The woman's mouth tightened, but she said nothing more, just turned to the younger woman, her niece, as Eli would later learn, and said, "Get inside." Clara gave Eli one last look, not unkind, not warm, just unreadable, and disappeared into the dim of the house. He learned her name in the store a week later. Old Silas, who ran the place, leaned across the counter and told him that's Clara Jennings' widow. Before she was 20, lives with her aunt, now keeps to herself. "Like your granddaddy used to." Silas also said something else, voice low as if telling a secret meant for only the dust between them. "Your grandfather wasn't crazy." Eli different, yes, but not crazy. Don't let this town decide for you what a man was worth. Eli didn't answer, just tipped his hat and left with his bag of coffee, and Salt Spring went on greening the hills. But the laughter in town hadn't softened. If anything, it found new teeth. One morning Eli woke to find the words "Fool's Nest" chalked again on his door, this time with a crude drawing beneath. Eth wiped it away without pause. Some things didn't deserve your time. It was on one of those gray afternoons, clouds stretched low over the ridge, that he saw Clara again. He was on the porch fixing a loose shutter. The smell of rain coming strong from the west. Down the narrow road from town came a figure in a plain blue dress, head bent against the wind, a basket hooked over one arm. She walked like someone used to carrying weight, and when she passed the turn that led up to his cabin, she glanced up without stopping. Her eyes held his for just a breath, then she was gone again into the thin rain. The days after that carried her into his sight more often, once at the creek gathering watercress, once outside the store with her aunt, once pausing on the far bank to rest her bucket. They never spoke beyond a nod or a single word, and yet something was shifting. It wasn't the fast, burning thing of a saloon romance. It was slower, quieter, like two rivers cutting toward each other underground. Only the faintest tremor of water on stone giving away the meeting to come. One evening, near the last light, Eli walked down to the creek to check his traps for muskrats. He found none, but across the water was Clara, standing still as a fence post, eyes on the ridge. Your cabin catches the light different than the rest of the hill, she said suddenly, like it's awake. Eli looked back toward it, surprised at her words. Maybe it is, he said, been sleeping a while. Though she gave the smallest of nods and turned back to her bucket, hauling it into her arms as the first stars began to show that night in the cabin. Eli sat at the table with his grandfather's wooden box in front of him. He traced the carved swirls with one finger, wondering who had cut them, wondering what they meant. It stayed locked, just as it had since the day he'd found it outside. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, the sound threading through the quiet, like a memory you can't quite place somewhere in town. Clara would be listening to the same rain, and though he couldn't have said why, the thought of that felt like a kind of company by now. Eli's days had begun to take shape. Mornings on the ridge, afternoons cutting wood or mending fence, evenings by the fire, watching the light fade over the hills. The laughter in town hadn't stopped, but it mattered less. The cabin's walls seemed to hold him a little closer each night, as if the place was slowly making up its mind about him. And, down in the valley, the woman by the creek moved through her own quiet days, her path and his not yet tangled, but drawing nearer all the same. Winter came like a hand closing over the valley first. The air turned sharp enough to bite, then the ground stiffened under frost that didn't melt by noon. By the end of November, the ridge was white in the mornings, and the creek ran slower. Each stone ringed with Eli kept to his work, chopping wood, sealing gaps in the cabin walls with moss and pitch. He'd learned long ago that winter was only hard on those who tried to fight it better, to work with it, keep the hearth fed, and your hands busy. The first snow came on a gray morning with wind that whispered of more to come. Eli was riding back from town, a sack of flowers slung over his shoulder, when he spotted a figure on the road ahead. Clarice was standing beside a small cart, tipped at an angle. One wheel sunk deep into the frozen ruts. The mule hitched to it, stamped its hooves in the cold, breath billowing white. Eli dismounted and walked to her. "Wheels gone bad," she said simply. "Can't get it loose to mend it." Here snowflakes had begun to stick in her hair, melting slow against the dark strands. "Storm's coming." Eli said, "You won't make it back to town in this. Come on, bring the mule, we'll wait it out at my place." She hesitated just long enough for the wind to pick up, then gave a small nod. By the time they reached the cabin, the snow was falling thick. The ridge disappeared into a white haze inside. Eli lit the fire and hung her coat on a peg by the door. Steam rose from the wet fabric, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and creek water. Clara stood near the hearth, hands out to the flames. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes softer than he'd seen them before. "You've kept this place warmer than I expected," she said. Eli smiled faintly. "It does most of the work itself." They sat at the small table with coffee, warming their hands. The only sounds were the fire's crackle and the hiss of snow against the window. Her eyes wandered to the shelf, to the small wooden box that had sat there since his first night back. "What's in it?" she asked. "Don't know," Eli answered. "No key to open it." She rose and crossed to it, lifting it down with care. Her fingers traced the carved swirls, then stopped at the corner, where 3 small letters had been pressed into the wood. MRM. She looked at him, something unreadable passing through her eyes. "Your grandfather. Did he ever speak of the river past the North Ridge?" "Not to me," Eli said. "Why?" "No reason," she murmured, and set the box back on the shelf. As the storm thickened, Clara began to speak in that slow, careful way of someone who has kept words locked away too long. She told him of the rancher she'd married at 18, a man twice her age with land enough to impress her aunt. He'd been kind at first, but his heart was in the cards and the bottle. 2 winters later, he was gone, leaving her nothing but debts and the sharp taste of other people's pity. "Worked every day since," she said quietly, "not for comfort, just to keep from being beholden to anyone." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the snow pressed like a wall of white. "Your grandfather was one of the only men in this town who ever treated me like I wasn't." Broken glass. The fire burned low as night fell, the cabin wrapped in the hush that only heavy snow can bring. Eli sat in the rocker, listening to the wind sweep over the ridge. He thought about her words, about the way the townsfolk had spoken of his grandfather. 4 years different. Yes, but maybe different wasn't a fault after all. Near midnight, as Eli banked the fire, Clara rose from the chair by the hearth and began to help. She moved icily around the room, as if she'd been in it before, reaching for the broom tucked in the corner. She brushed the boards by the shelf, and her foot caught on a loose plank. She crouched to straighten it, and when she lifted the board, something glinted in the lantern light, a small brass key, dulled with age. Eli stared. "I've searched this place top to bottom," he said. "Guess it was waiting for the right hands." She replied. The key turned in the wooden box's lock. With a soft click inside was a neat bundle of oilcloth, tied with twine. Eli unwrapped it slowly, revealing a stack of folded papers and a small leather journal. The papers were deeds, not just for the ridge, but for hundreds of acres, stretching north and west rivers, pasture, timber, more land than anyone in Dry Creek thought the Mercers had ever owned. The journal's first page was dated 25 years earlier in his grandfather's rough hand. The words began, "If Eli ever comes to this place, he should know what I've done, and why." Eli read in silence, Clara watching from across the table. The pages told of a man who had quietly bought up land others would have stripped bare for profit. He'd kept it for the creek, for the animals, for the simple reason that some places shouldn't be sold to the highest bidder. When Eli finally looked up, Clara's expression was not surprise, but something steadier, as if she'd suspected the truth all along. "That's why they called him crazy," she said softly, "because he wouldn't play the game they all wanted him to." Eli nodded. "And now they'll come for it again." Morning broke clear, the snow fresh and deep. Clara helped feed the mule before setting off toward town, her footprints the only marks in the white at the door. She turned back to him. "You could sell it, Eli. Live comfortable the rest of your days." He shook his head. "Not yet." She gave a faint smile. "If you ever want help fixing the place, you know where to find me." That night, Eli stood on the ridge with the deed in his hands. The wind tugged at the paper, but he held it firm below. The town lay quiet, its laughter muted by the snow and distance. They didn't know yet, but they wouldn't when they did. Things on this ridge, and between him and the woman by the creek, would never be the same. Spring came in a rush that year. The snow melted almost overnight, feeding the creek until it ran quick and loud, spilling silver light under the morning sun. The ridge woke with it, grass pushing through the wet earth, buds swelling on the willow branches, and the cabin, once gray with neglect, now stood straighter, its boards oiled, its windows mended. Clara had been there often through the weeks after the snowstorm. They worked side by side without much talk, mending fence lines, planting a garden in the dark soil behind the cabin. It wasn't comfort they were chasing, it was steadiness, the kind that makes comfort possible. Word of the deeds had slipped into town like smoke through a crack. At first, it was only a whisper. That Mercer's boy had more land than he knew what to do with. Then came the riders, hats in hand, voices oily with offers you could name your price. One man said, eyes sliding toward Clara, as if she might influence him. Eli's answer was the same to all of them. Not selling it puzzled them, even angered some. Land was money, and money was the measure of a man in Dry Creek. But Eli seemed content to measure himself by other means. Old Silas rode up one afternoon with a sack of flour, sat on the porch and told Eli the part of the story the journal hadn't held. Your grandfather bought that land to keep it whole. Silas said knew the big ranch outfits would cut it to pieces for cattle, said it needed someone stubborn enough to hold it the way it was. Lee looked out over the ridge, feeling the weight of the paper folded in his pocket. Maybe stubborn runs in the blood, he said quietly. The turning came on a hot, dry day. In late April, the air was sharp with the smell of dust and sun-baked grass. Eli had just come in from the far pasture when he saw the smoke, a thin black thread rising against the blue sky from the next valley over. By the time he reached the edge of his land, the fire had grown wild, snapping through the brittle grass and climbing toward the ridge. The wind was wrung, carrying it straight toward the cabin, and beyond that, toward the town below. He didn't think, only moved, cutting across the pasture. He reached the old clearing his grandfather had kept open, a wide strip of bare earth where nothing had been allowed to grow. Eli had wondered about it before. Now he understood. Clara arrived on horseback, breathless, her dress dark with sweat. What do you need? She asked the line. Eli said, pointing to the clearing. We'll cut the fire off here. They worked without pause, Eli with the axe, Clara dragging brush aside, stamping out sparks. The heat came in waves, the roar of the flames like a living thing bearing down. Smoke stung their eyes and filled their lungs, but the wind shifted just enough to let their line hold. By nightfall the fire lay broken against the strip of earth, the worst of it dying in red embers under the stars. From below came the faint sound of voices, men from town who had ridden up, expecting to see the ridge burned to ash. Instead they found it standing, the cabin safe, and the town spared from the fire that would have reached it by morning in the days after. The laughter in Dry Creek changed. It wasn't gone, but it had lost its edge. Men who'd once called him a fool now tipped their hats. Clara's aunt, standing on her porch, gave Eli a single nod that held more than words could have managed. Clara herself came up the ridge one evening, with a basket of bread still warm from the oven. They sat on the porch steps, the sun folding itself down behind the hills. You saved the town, she said. Eli shook his head. My grandfather did. I just stood where he told me to. She smiled at that, looking out over the green sweep of land. You could still sell it, you know. Live anywhere. Eli's gaze stayed on the horizon. Why would I leave what finally feels like home? The last light went soft and gold, the kind of light that makes you think of all the evenings before and all the ones still to come. The cabin behind them was warm, its windows spilling firelight into the gathering dark. Eli spoke low, almost to himself. They can laugh all they want, Clara, but they'll never laugh the same way again. She turned to look at him then, and in her eyes was that steadiness they had been building together without ever naming it. The kind of steadiness that could hold through winters and fires alike. Night. The ridge was quiet. Coyotes sang somewhere far off, and the creek whispered to itself under the moon. In the cabin, the old wooden box sat empty on the shelf, its contents now carried in Eli's mind and in the choices he would make from here on. The land was his, yes, but more than that, the place had claimed him. And as the fire burned low, and Clara's head rested lightly against his shoulder, Eli felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not victory, but belonging. Some folks will measure you by the shine of your boots or the weight in your pocket. Let them keep to your ridge, keep to your work, and one day they may see what you've been building in the quiet all along. If this tale found you, drop a word below. Tell me where you're listening from, and tell me if you've ever had your own old cabin, something others laughed at until it turned out to be worth more than they could have guessed.